Boa tarde, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Bryan Pitts, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Latin American Institute here at UCLA, and also affiliated with the Center for Brazilian Studies, the two units that have co-organized today's event, the Brazilian Presidential Election Roundtable. As probably most of you know, Brazil held its presidential and legislative elections on Sunday, and the election that most of us here outside of Brazil are really paying attention to is the presidential election. Headed to a runoff on October 30th are the incumbent president, Jair Bolsonaro, and former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who was president of Brazil between 2003 and 2010. We have a distinguished panel of experts on Brazilian politics here to speak with us today about the election. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Susana Hecht, the director of the Center for Brazilian Studies here at UCLA, who will introduce our panelists.
First of all, am I on here? I'm just checking. Okay, because I can't see myself as being on. First of all, I think that one could not ask for a better panel than the one that we've assembled here of really serious analysts from a number of perspectives, and also long-term Brazilian, not only Brazilian analysts, but also Brazilian citizens. In any case, the point being that we are in a kind of unusual situation in which one of the most important democracies in the world is up in play. This is not only a question of politics, but it's also a question of environment and also a question of global environment. So one couldn't ask for a more important time in which to have this kind of discussion. Let me introduce the panelists on our roundtable. One is Gladys Mitchell-Walthour, who is the Dan Blue Endowed Chair in North Carolina. She's a scholar of Afro-Brazilian political behavior and opinion and affirmative action in Brazil. As many of you may know, there has been quite a bit of erosion about the politics of Afro-Brazilianists in Brazil under the Jair moment. She's the author of The Politics of Blackness, Racial Identity and Political Behavior in Contemporary Brazil, and has been the past president of BRASA, the Brazilian Studies Association. So that's Gladys. Lena Lavinas, I've known for ages. She's been a professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She's worked widely in Europe and elsewhere in the United States. She's even been a visiting prof at UCLA. You'll see that there's a little bit of a UCLA link here, also with James Green. She's a professor of welfare economics, and she's been a visiting professor at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin, and also SOAS, the School of Asian African Studies, and in London. She has a wide and comprehensive set of analyses about social policy in Brazil, and has been one of the major thinkers on social policy in Brazil. James Green, who got a degree from UCLA, I have to say. So he's sort of part of our, how do we say, in these colloquial times, the part of the UCLA family, even though he has wandered away from us. He's the Carlos Emanuel de Céspedes Professor of Latin American History and also a professor of Brazilian history at Brown. He's also a driving force behind the Washington Brazil office, and has been a very important activist within the United States on Brazil questions. If you are a Brazilianist, you will certainly know who you are, if not personally, at least from your inbox. So he has been a person who's written widely on the practice of Brazil's cultural dynamics, particularly in LGBTQT history, and Brazilian politics, as well as dictatorship politics. And he's a very important activist within the global and as well as regional political dynamics. So we have a very distinguished panel, and I should just shut up and let them go ahead. So we'll start with Gladys. Gladys, what do you think about what is the what here?
All right. So first of all, thank you, Susanna and Bryan and anyone else who was involved in organizing this panel. I'm extremely happy to be on this panel with so many distinguished activists and of course scholars, especially Jim. It's always great working with Jim. So I have a PowerPoint. So I am going to share my PowerPoint. If there are any problems, please let me know. But I expect for this to be around 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm going to try to share this screen here. Sorry. Okay. All right, let me go to. Okay, can you?
I can see it, but you sound a little bit like you're in the washing machine.
Yeah, we can see you.
I'm
We can see
sorry,
the home screen to your phone.
I can't really see any guesses. So anyone can just say yes.
Gladys,
your sound is bad.
Yeah, your sound is
Yeah,
bad,
it sounds bad.
and we were only able to briefly see the home screen to your phone, but not
I have
the
a blank
PowerPoint
screen right now.
I'm trying to open your PowerPoint from here. Maybe
Muffled.
for you.
Oh, so you can't. Okay, if you can see this, okay. So let me. And then Bryan, is there any way that you can share?
I can, but
Okay,
my desktop picked this moment to do a mandatory update of Microsoft Office, so I'm waiting for it to open PowerPoint. I've been waiting for like 5 minutes. So if you go ahead and start, I can get the
Well, perhaps we should switch to another speaker while these technical difficulties are being resolved.
Could be.
So
we can do that. Or the other thing is, I don't have to use the PowerPoint.
Okay, if you don't want to use it, that would be great, because then we could go straight in.
Okay. All right. So the three things that I wanted to talk about today is first, the status, or no, really the Brazil's political climate. And this is going into the election. So first I wanted to talk about that. And then I'm going to talk about what happened, right, in the first round. Trying to end on a good note. So looking at elections beyond the presidential election. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of the political climate before the presidential election is to really to go back to 2016, when there was the impeachment or the political coup of Dilma Rousseff. And during that time, and after the impeachment, there was a real threat to academic freedom. So I remember the Brazil Studies Association and other organizations really trying to support our Brazilian colleagues who wanted to either teach classes or hold seminars to talk about what was going on in Brazil, but there was a real threat to academic freedom. Of course, in 2018, there was the assassination of Marielle Franco, who was a Black woman leader, also part of the LGBT community, and also who fought on behalf of low-income people, Black people LGBTQ plus people. And she was also really against the militarization of favelas. So she was very outspoken. And then in 2018, there was also the killing of Mestre Moadu Katende, who was a very famous capoeirista. And he was simply expressing who he voted for in the 2018 election in a bar. And someone went home, came back and stabbed him to death simply for his expression of voting for the PT candidate, Haddad at the time. Of course, John Willis, you can go to the third slide, Bryan, thank you. John Willis went into self-exile in 2019. I believe now he is still in Europe, in Spain. So again, this is just to give everyone, or not to give, but to remind everyone, right, that Brazil was already kind of in this anti-democratic political climate. Next slide, please. Of course, we know what happened in 2018 was that Bolsonaro was elected. And then very recently, this year, 2 Lula supporters were killed by Bolsonaro supporters. Next slide. The other thing that I wanted to mention that's also really important is the threats to Afro-Brazilian women, politicians, and activists. And I really felt this when I was in Rio over the summer. And this goes beyond, right, even Black women, politicians, and activists. We can also think about Indigenous activists, LGBTQ plus activists who aren't Black. But there's a real threat that people are experiencing. So here I'm just showing, for example, Benny Brioli, who is a Black trans woman and politician, and who has received numerous threats. Of course, Renata Souza, Carol D'Artora, who was actually just elected as a federal deputy, and Monica Cunha, who is an activist, who they all continue to receive these death threats. So again, just a reminder of the climate that Brazil was in. I'm going to quickly go over, so next slide, some really interesting findings that I have from some research that I just did in Brazil from May to July as a Fulbright scholar. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, so I'm not going to read the quotes, but these are just some of the findings. So we interviewed 28 Afro-Brazilian women, Auxílio Brasil beneficiaries, and we have a number of questions, but I'm focusing on the political questions. And we did the interviews in Bahia, in 2 places. One was Cachoeira, the other was Itaparica. The reason that I chose those 2 places is that most of my research is usually in Salvador, Sao Paulo, Rio, really large cities, and I was trying to go beyond these large cities. And so we did these in-depth interviews, and what we found is that 96% of participants responded that they relate most to the PT or Lula. Nearly 91% of respondents selected 8 or 10, which means they strongly relate to the PT. So they were first asked, which political party do you most relate to? And after that, they were asked from a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest. How do you relate to the political party that you named? 65% rated the PT or Lula a 10, demonstrating a high degree of satisfaction. And the reason that I have the PT/Lula is that for them to name a political party, they said Lula as a political party. Okay, and you can pass this one. I'm not going to read the quotes. I really just want to focus on the findings. So in terms of voting, we asked the question, if Lula and Bolsonaro run in the 2022 presidential election, who would you vote for? And these are just some of the answers, but what is most interesting is that 89% said they would vote for Lula in 2022. The demographics and voting patterns in Brazil, you would expect for people from the Northeast to support Lula. However, when we start looking at intersectional identities such as religion, some of the findings go against what we would expect. And also, I just wanted to really focus on women with these intersectional identities in terms of race, class, and gender to really kind of see how they explained who they would vote for or which political party they felt they most related to. And so, next slide. Thank you. And so for the next slide, I was really interested in these, a lot of the political science literature basically says that for those that support the PT who are petistas or who demonstrate petismo, value principles of equality and are middle class, right? So in other words, not Black. Again, this is the political science literature. And then when political scientists talk about Lulismo or Lulistas, they usually say that people are less educated, that they are voting due to retrospective evaluations. So kind of saying, oh, he was a great president before, or people will talk about charisma. What I found was evidence of both. So women talked about, so first of all, they said they relate to the PT. And then they talked about the PT as this political party that was dedicated to Black rights. And that you never see in the literature when people talk about petismo. They don't talk about race, but the women did. And they also talked about the PT as this party that values equality. And also they talked about themselves also valuing equality. So in terms of Lulismo, these are some of the responses. So yes, women did demonstrate retrospective evaluations, but they also talked about Lula's commitment to the poor. And some of them voted really to express an anti-Bolsonaro vote. And that was about 38%. To go over some of these findings, because these findings are what also kind of gave me some hope going into the election. And of course, Lula still did well. I was just a little thrown off by the high level of support that Bolsonaro received. Okay, the next part that I'm going to go to is just to kind of talk about, well, what exactly happened on Sunday. Next slide. So these are just some maps, which I'm sure many of you have already seen. Again, they kind of demonstrate what I was talking about before in terms of PT candidates receiving more support in the North and the Northeast. And I'm not saying that they only receive support there, but you can see in the maps that in general, they receive support in the North, in the Northeast. And then, so you can just kind of look across these maps and you can see where support is coming from. Of course, Lula did make some inroads into some new places as compared to Haddad in 2018. But in general, these are kind of the trend. The other thing I should mention is that I just saw a video today of Bolsonaro talking about Lula received support from the Northeast. He said that they were illiterate and lack culture. So that is what, that is now how Bolsonaro is describing Lula supporters. Okay, next slide. Some of the factors that I wanted to talk about in terms of explaining Bolsonaro's high percentage of votes is one, which is something political scientists talk about a lot in terms of social desirability. So perhaps when these polls were taken, people were just giving the answer that they felt was socially desirable. Maybe they were too embarrassed to actually express that they were going to vote for Bolsonaro. And so that's why the polls looked very different than the results that we actually saw. The other thing that I thought about a lot was this kind of notion of in the media, you could see the violence from Bolsonaro supporters, but also people being very aggressive in different rallies or things. Supporters are that they are these very aggressive, loud type people. But perhaps they also have people who, what I would say, are engaged in quiet violence, right? So these are the people that still support him, and who, due to them supporting him, there will be a lot of harm, which there has already been harm, right, to the environment, to marginalized communities, to LGBTQ plus people, to Black Brazilians. We could go on, right? So some people engaging in quiet violence by supporting him at the polls, but you don't see them out in the streets. So maybe that's one reason that his votes were so high. Another is just how good his campaign has been in terms of mobilizing people. So through the use of social media, but also his relationship with mobilizing evangelical churches, right? So, and I've had at least 2 friends who, like very early on, they were already worried about this because they are both leftists, and of course there are other leftist evangelicals, but they were really concerned about the messages that they kept receiving from their churches. To the other point I have here about fear and right-wing ideology as strategies that he has used in the past and is obviously still continuing to use to get support. And now I'm going to try to end on a good note or a positive note here. Next slide. Is just to briefly mention that while many of us are disappointed, including myself, that Lula didn't win in the first round, and I'm hoping he will win in the second round, is that there were some wins. So Sonia Guajajara was elected as a federal deputy. The number of Afro-Brazilian women in Congress has went from, or not in the Senate, I'm talking about the federal deputies, but that number has went from 13 to 29. 2 Black women, trans women, were elected as federal deputy. Talidia Petroni was re-elected. Renata Souza was elected to Rio's Congress. And so there were some wins. So I just want to make sure that we focus on the fact that some good things happen. Unfortunately, a number of I think it was 20 out of the 27 senators elected actually are Bolsonaro supporters. So that is going to be very difficult. Even if Lula wins, it's not going to be easy for him. But yeah, so that is how I will end. Even though the first round was disappointing, there were some glimmers of hope there. And last slide is just to say, obrigada. Thank you for your attention.
Wow. Well, of course, we wish it were different, but why don't we go on now to Lena, and then James will sum up at the end. Is that okay with everybody?
Sure. As our audience has questions, they are welcome to submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And then we will go over all of them after everyone is done presenting. Oh, and Lena, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I will restart. So hi, everybody. I'm happy to be meeting up again with friends and delighted to have been invited to this roundtable to discuss with you and those attending this panel online the fallout from the very polarized elections underway in Brazil. Unfortunately, it's not over yet, and we are in the very heart of a decisive moment. There will be countless aspects to bring to this debate. So many are the issues raised by the results of the first round of these elections. Following on Gladys' presentation, I will highlight two important aspects of these elections. So I will really focus on what happened 3 days ago. First, I would like to point out that the turn to the right that begins with the 2016 parliamentary coup, as mentioned by Gladys, against President Rousseff, and leads to Bolsonaro being elected in 2018, has not been reversed and seems to have deepened with an institutional entrenchment of the far right in Congress. Not only did Bolsonaro outperform the polls, but the far right scored a major victory, getting several seats in parliament. The evangelical caucus in Congress hope to extend their representation in the House, but remain at 20%, as in the past legislature. However, we have elected the most conservative and reactionary Senate in the post-democratization period. Among the 20 most voted lawmakers, 7 are from Bolsonaro's party. Only 4 come from the left. At this point, Bolsonaro's base of support parties total 184 members in the Chamber of Deputies, part of it representing the far right, against 156 from the center right and 140 from the left front, maybe even less. These are 3 major coalitions now represented in Congress, but we don't know yet how they will cooperate and operate, especially the center. There is another very important aspect to highlight. With the exception of Judge Sérgio Moro, who led the car wash operation, which proved to be a great fallacy, Bolsonaro's former supporters who broke with him for various reasons failed to get elected, while his most radical supporters, who were responsible as minister for implementing his destructive agenda, now have seats in the House or in the Senate. This means that we have underestimated the adversary and the resilience of what is dubbed anti-Petismo. That is an ideological position that opposes everything that comes from the left, personified in the Workers' Party that ruled the country for 14 years. The terrible things that have occurred under Bolsonaro's administration, such as the almost 700,000 deaths from the coronavirus pandemic, the practice of denying silence, the open and violent discrimination against women, Blacks, and other sexual and racial minorities, such as indigenous people, the dismantling of public institutions in the Republican apparatus, notably the health and the higher education systems, the constant threat to democracy, denying that poverty and hunger endanger the lives of some 50 million people, and that there are tens of thousands living on the streets completely deprived and unprotected, the deliberate destruction of environmental protection policies, threatening all of our biomes, the lies and manipulation using his position as president, the allegations of corruption involving his entire family, gun liberalization as part of a law and order agenda. The list is long and there would be much more to add. But none of this was enough for 43% of the electorate to prevent Bolsonaro from being reconducted to have the executive. Although 57.2 million Brazilians want to get rid of Bolsonaro, there are 51 million people who support not only his agenda, but his disrespectful, humiliating, and authoritarian behavior. Although Bolsonarism has consolidated its hegemony in the political arena in this election, which explains why Bolsonaro has not questioned the electoral system, nor the results of the polls in the first round, there have been major achievements, some already stressed by Gladys. We elected 2 trans candidates, the diversity in parliament increased slightly with the presence of more women and Blacks, although the majority of Black lawyers are now elected are affiliated to right-wing parties, and for Indigenous women, as shown by Gladys, were also elected. In parallel, new young leaders are emerging, both on the right and on the left. In this case, Guilherme Boulos from the party further to the left, the PSOL, was the second most voted lawmaker in Brazil, just behind a young Bolsonarista and evangelical influencer who is active in social networks. He has 8 million followers. They represent two different methods of doing politics, two radically different projects for our society and conflicting values, which means that the confrontation in Congress will be ferocious. If you are able to preserve democracy with the re-election of Lula, then it seems possible to contest and reverse the hegemony of the extreme right. My second point, what prevailed during the electoral campaign was a strongly ideological debate, which managed to mobilize a very conservative society that feels threatened by women's freedom, same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights, and so on and so forth. Bolsonaro played up social conservatism and the threat to the return of communism. Because of that, the conservative fringe of Brazilian society ends up being intertwined, blended with a much smaller segment of it, whose size we cannot estimate for sure, that expresses authoritarian veins. Advocating a conservative agenda centered on the defense of the family, we know his slogan is God, homeland, family, having added freedom. Bolsonaro has managed to rally broad segments of the population who experience numerous forms of insecurity on a daily basis, a large part of them not realizing the fascist threats that underlie many of his actions and his way of governing. What political scientist André Singer has dubbed autocracy with a fascist bias, that is a form of authoritarianism that is characterized by a personal rule using fascist techniques of mass mobilization and conspiracy theories. Thus, autocracy with a fascist bias has set the tone of the political debate in Brazil. Bolsonaro's followers live in a parallel and closed world in a media sphere, as put by Castro Rocha, controlled by Bolsonaristas. They do not seem interested in participating in the public debate, addressing the big issues that should matter to Brazilians as a whole, concerning employment, wages, the cost of living crisis, social protection, abysmal levels of inequality, the regressive tax system, the unprecedented levels of household indebtedness, the genocide of indigenous people, and the recurrent killings of young Black men, the country's insertion in the global economy, or how to address the climate emergency, an issue that Bolsonaro continues to disdain and deny. So it's urgent to shift the focus of the debate in the second round and bring to the fore what is the program of this political front in the making that is now coming together to defeat Bolsonarism and guarantee the democratic rule of law. Lula received the support of candidates who came in second and third place. He's also being backed by names of great political influence, such as Cardoso, among others. Negotiations are advancing, and the PT has already accepted to incorporate proposals from the programs of Ciro and Simone Tebet, which is very positive. But while the agribusiness sector has already expressed its massive support for Bolsonaro, some of the financial sector's big stars are aligning themselves with Lula, but hoping that he will resume the interrupted economic project that prevailed during his first term, and that was markedly committed to neoliberal reforms. So today the goal is to be able to capture the debate in order to adequately inform the population of what is at stake. To be honest, I don't know how to do this, but this is what needs to be done. In the first phase of the race, Lula talked most about the most of the time about his past achievements. Now it's time to talk about the future we want for ourselves, and explain why only under Lula's leadership will it be possible to promote structural changes and reunite in this society. It's also important to make people understand that Brazil's leadership on the global stage should not be assumed as a representative of the most backward and intolerant societal forces, as the Bolsonaro project is willing to do in the context of the defeat of Trump. To defeat the far right in Brazil and contribute to its defeat in the world, we must first defeat Bolsonaro and then reverse the influence of Bolsonarism that has taken deep roots in Brazil. This goal is within reach because Lula remains the front runner. In the first round, he lacked less than 2 million votes, around 1.6% of the total. He outpolled Bolsonaro with more than 6 million votes. Experts say that now the capital in dispute adds up to 9 million votes. The big challenge, however, is to win by a good margin, to dissuade Bolsonaro and his electorate from contesting the results. I'm afraid, however, that although victory is very likely, it risks being by a small margin, given the dynamic of recent growth in the number of Bolsonaro supporters. I'll stop here for now. Thank you for having me.
You're on mute, Susana. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Looks like you're still on mute, Susanna. Maybe hit it one more time.
Whoop.
There we go.
All I was saying is we're now going to James.
Okay.
After both of these disturbing, yes, there is a silver lining, but it's still pretty cloudy. James, you want to go ahead?
Sure, and I want to thank you, Bryan and Susanna, for organizing this event, and it's wonderful to be with Gladys on another panel, and Lena, who's a deep, wonderful surprise when I went to Princeton for a semester. This fabulous one was in the office next to me. So it's nice to see you again. It's been a while. Well, since many things have been said, I don't want to repeat. That's the danger of being third. But I do want to kind of emphasize some of the points that have been made and point to some other issues. So first of all, I think in what Lena pointed out, and it's really important, is to understand that the elections in Brazil is the most important in its country's history. And it really reflects the serious rise of the far right internationally as reflected in Brazil. And it's a serious danger for democracy, not only in Brazil, but worldwide. So a defeat of Bolsonaro is a defeat of Trump. It's a defeat of fascism in Italy. It's a defeat of the far right everywhere. The second thing is that Brazil is in so many ways it's like the United States, but it's even more so since in the last 4 years. And I think that the polarization that people have experienced in the United States with Trump's election and his ongoing influence in the Republican Party, the fact the Republican Party has moved to the far right and has basically expelled all moderate, if you can call them moderate Republicans, and caused actually, ironically, more of a shift to the left in the Democratic Party in terms of proposals to counter the Republicans, is a very similar process that's going on in Brazil. And so whether Bolsonaro has an historic support of 45% of the population or 30% or 35%, we still don't know. There's definitely a hardcore ideological center of 10 to 20%. And if we add to that people who are very attracted to his ideas because of social policies, it's a really serious block of conservative voters. And although historically Brazil has been divided into three main blocs since at least 1945, when we have a way to measure that, a bloc that was to the left, another bloc in the center, and another bloc to the right. The far right in Brazil, that was a part of what was the UDN, or later what was a part of Arena, was smaller in my assessment of to what we have today. That the far right is much more consolidated and has a feeling of legitimacy, in large part because of the international conjuncture that favors them and the ways in which they see their equals in other parts of the world. I've been in Brazil since March, and I've been conducting what I call jokingly Data Uber, which is talking to Uber drivers, trying to figure out their narratives, what they're thinking. The overwhelming majority support Bolsonaro. And what is really clear from discussing with them, and I'm not looking for statistics, but more to understand narrative, is that the worst virus that has infected Brazil in the last 5 years is the Bolsonaro virus, because people absolutely believe everything he says. They do not trust the polls. They do not trust the judiciary. They don't trust the media. And they're very confident that he has an overwhelming majority. In fact, they were actually disappointed that he didn't get the 60% that he predicted he would get in the first round. These are people who do not speak rationally. You cannot argue with them. They're ideologically closed-minded. Much like MAGA people in the United States, it's very hard to talk to them and convince them with any kind of line of rational argumentation. And they're here to stay for a long period of time. And so this is a first really serious, I think, problem we all have to face and recognize. Now, the polls were wrong on one level. They correctly estimated that Lula would get a certain percentage of the population, around 48 to 50, 51%, and he got 48%, 48.4%. So they were right there, but they got the Bolsonaro supporters wrong. And I think there's several reasons for that, but I think the main two reasons are people really not answering the polls, and therefore, or not answering them honestly, and therefore giving a distorted idea of what the relative strength of Bolsonaro has been here. And that has not only been something that we've assumed was the case, we also assumed that was the case among evangelical Christians, but now we're actually seeing documents circulating by Bolsonaro supporters in their campaign saying to people not to answer to the pollsters. Let them get it wrong is what they're saying in the election. So this caught people by surprise in the results that didn't jive with what the polls predict, except for one poll that was relatively accurate, the Atlas poll. It also had to do with the dilemma of very last minute, the day before, the day of the election, decision-making by people who decided that it looked like Lula might win, and to block Lula, they shifted from their support from the third and the fourth candidates, Ciro Gomes and Simone Tebet, to vote for Bolsonaro. So the statistics are relatively wrong, but I think that they're also an eye-opener to the strength and the depth of the support that Bolsonaro has in that regard. Now, as Lena also mentioned, Lula, in an attempt to build a broad coalition, already had built an alliance with other 10 parties, which is it's the broadest electoral alliance that he's managed to forge. And now he is bringing together sectors of the MDB and sectors of the PSDB to his side, and certain supporters in some of the other political parties which are not going to endorse a candidate. The right has consolidated itself around Bolsonaro, but there's not been a real significant shift of political forces to him. Much more so has been the case of people who were in the center-right, who declared themselves to support Lula. And Simone Tebet, she did that, although it's very interesting. She didn't have a picture taken with Lula. She chose to do it on her own and to have autonomy, and will be using that influence to negotiate on the ultimate program and the policies of Lula. And Ciro Gomes did the strangest thing of really not endorsing Lula, but not speaking against him, but his party is clearly going to support Lula, and that will be an important element in winning the second round of the elections. I think unless there's something that we really cannot see out there, Lula is likely to win. It would require Bolsonaro to gain 9 million more votes and take them away from Lula. I think it's very difficult. I think 90% of the people know who they want to vote for, what they voted for. The big question will be turnout. If people actually show up for the second round, and their political violence and threats of political violence, long lines, all could discourage people from going out to vote. On the other hand, I think people understand the stakes at hand, not only on the left, but on the right. So I don't know that it will actually be the case that there's significant turnout. Finally, I want to make comments on three different things. One is the international vote, which is very insignificant. It's less than 1 million people compared to Brazil, but I think it was very interesting to see. Not only did Lula sweep the European elections and many other parts of the world, but did a very good job in the United States, which has a relatively small voting body compared to the number of Brazilians, or more than a million Brazilians in the United States, but only 50 some thousand voted in 18 and 69,000 voted this year. So it was an increase. Whereas in the past, Bolsonaro supporters won in the first round everywhere. This time in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., Lula won. And it's pretty likely that in the next round, there will be a flip of the vote in New York. Whereas Bolsonaro still remains very strong in Miami, the area that is covered by the Miami district voting booth, the Houston area, the Georgia area, and the Boston area. So there's a strong Bolsonaro support in the United States, but nevertheless, I think due to an initiative by Brazilians to get everyone to be having their documents in order to be able to vote and to really get out the vote, really change the dynamics, and they're strikingly different. Lula, Haddad got 3,300 votes in 18, and Lula got 21,000 votes. So just an amazing increase in votes and enthusiasm for the left. And finally, the question of Bolsonaro challenging the election results, which is a strategy that he appropriated from Trump and continued to make a point of until the week of the elections, and inferring that he couldn't trust them and that the military didn't trust them, and was supporting the military's discrediting of the election process. I was a part of an international human rights committee that was overseeing and accompanying the elections, and I was incredibly impressed by the procedure. They really are far superior. The voting system is far superior to the United States in all ways. There's a very meticulous way of conforming that there's no possibility of tinkering with the results. So Bolsonaro retreated to a certain extent from making direct accusations, saying he wasn't sure, he was going to wait to see what the military had to say, to leave that path open so that if in fact he loses, and especially if he loses by a small margin, then I think it's pretty obvious that he is going to challenge the election results, much as Aécio did in 2014, when there was ultimately a 3.8% difference between Dilma Rousseff and Aécio. And I think it's very likely that he will do that again. And this then goes to the point that I think is extremely essential to understanding this, having to do with the work that the Washington Brazil office has done. Washington Brazil office was an initiative that came out of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, that was founded in December of 2018. Gladys and I are the co-chairs. And the Washington Brazil office is now a 501c3 and has done incredibly deep, hard work in Congress. And our most recent victory was that Senator Bernie Sanders passed a resolution in the Senate with unanimous consent. In other words, any Republican who wished to oppose it would have killed the resolution, but no one chose to, which basically said that the United States believes in the free exercise of democracy in Brazil and trusts the electoral system, and wants to recognize the winner of the elections. And if there's any attempt to carry out some kind of coup or disruption of the elections by illegal forces, the United States will cut off all economic and military aid to Brazil. And this was one of many efforts, some from the administration, Biden administration themselves, and others from the movement in favor of democracy in Brazil, to guarantee that after the end of the election period, the 30th, when the Federal Election Commission announced the winners, that European and the United States recognize the results, and regardless of who actually wins the elections. This is very, very important, and I think our challenges in next year were going to be greater, as if Lula wins the elections, he's going to face a very difficult economic problems to solve, a broad coalition that he's going to have to put together to get elected, which means he's going to have to make a lot of deals in Congress, including a lot of concessions for core program values of the Workers' Party. But it's essential, because just to finalize, yet today, in order to buy votes, Bolsonaro has promised a whole bunch of programs and is going to increase money to the poor, hopefully to get their support. they've just frozen all federal aid to the universities. And so basically, they just cut off the livelihood of the federal university system, which is the best in Latin America and one of the best in the world, in order to pay bribes for people to win the elections, which is absolutely illegal based on all electoral law, but no one can challenge it because the money that he's paying is going to poor people, and it will look very bad if anyone questions that. So it's a very serious situation we're in. We're all nervous in Brazil. I think Lena and I and everyone we know is just absolutely on pins and needles. I think Lula will be victorious, but the time ahead is going to be very difficult. And if you're interested more in the Washington Brazil office, go to our website, Washington Brazil office. We have an international manifesto that we're circulating. We'd like you all to sign it, calling for free and fair elections and recognition of the results on October 30th. And if you choose to sign that, would be great to help this effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. This is, and Lena and Gladys, all of you have presented a rather, we would like it to be a more optimistic scenario. It's not lacking in, bright spots, but still pretty complicated. I'd like one or the other of you to talk about the fact that actually the PT did extremely well. As an Amazonianist, I always want to say, but they all went, most of them went for PT, not of course Mato Grosso, but other parts of it, really the North and Northeast. So how would you explain that? You can look at those electoral maps. We don't have them up.
Are you asking how to explain how well the PT did in the North?
Yeah.
So I think it's a mixed bag. I think the map can be a little confusing because it's a very strong support for Bolsonaro because of the people who are involved in illegal animal hunting, lumbering, logging, and mining, and encroaching on indigenous territories. And there's a lot of relatively poor people who see this as their source of income and survival, and therefore very strongly support Bolsonaro's promises to stop demarcation of indigenous territories and prevent that will allow there to be an economic use of this exploitation of these lands, which he claims are being unfairly withheld from the Brazilian economy. So, I mean, there are urban pockets of support that the left and the center left has.
The larger numbers were for, plus for the PT.
Right, but I think what I'm saying is that the three areas of traditional support for the PT, for the Bolsonaro has been the North, the Southwest, and the South. And I think those, they still are very serious strongholds. But on the other hand, the North, as in the Northeast and in parts of in the Southeast, have large millions of people who are poor and dispossessed, many of them who identify with the Workers' Party program. I don't know if Lena or Gladys wanted to add more to that.
Yeah, maybe I will add something. It's important also to realize that Bolsonaro, he reduced his penetration in the Southeast, and Southeast Brazil is 42% of the electorate. And despite the fact that he won in São Paulo, he won in Rio, and he won in Espírito Santo, not in Minas Gerais, because Minas Gerais, it was very surprising. Lula won in Minas Gerais. It's the second largest electoral body. So it's very important. But in any case, in all three states, he reduced his performance. So this is also something that means that the utile vote, those who, as Jimmy said, that they anticipated their vote in the second round because they thought that Lula would win in the first round. So it was important to really block Lula's victory. And then they anticipated their vote on Bolsonaro. I think that somehow they have already, let's say, used this utile vote. And so what lasts is something much more positive for Lula. So I think that Lula will increase his influence in Southeast Brazil, which is very important. And also, I think that what happened in the north, it's important because I think that there is a reaction to what is going on in the Amazon, because this had a lot of publicity in Brazil. You see, we've been killing the indigenous people every day, almost every day. There was this also killing, murder with the indigenous, and also done who were found dead and killed in the Amazon. So there is, I think, kind of a reaction of the local society, the regional society, but as Ginny said, Bolsonaro is still extremely powerful in Northeast Brazil, and he was able to elect some senators from the north in his own coalition. So we don't know how things will evolve, but I think that you see, for now, things are still changing and shifting very quickly. But I would say that what he got during the first round, I'm not sure he will keep it in the second round. So I think this is a novelty, despite the fact that he has a large support from all governors. And you see that we cannot imagine that governors will be able to really turn the votes of their state electorate at once. It's not the way things happen. So it will depend on the rhythm and the dynamics of the campaign trail now.
And can I just jump in to say one thing? There's excuse me, Gladys. This is a translator's issue. I was looking for a week for what the word for voto útil is. And I think that the best translation is strategic vote.
Okay, thanks.
Because we don't really have it in English, but that's the term most people use. Excuse me, Gladys.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add on to kind of what has already been said. Just to say that, even discussing these, kind of outcomes, when you think about the deputy senator, so we have some contradictory results, right? So we have you can look at support for Bolsonaro, for the actual voting for him. Then you can also consider the support that he received in terms of senators who are some of his allies. But at the same time, as I was talking about before, so that's part of politics, that we have to look at all these contradictions and consider what's going to happen right in the second round. Like, is there a role for some of the federal deputies to play from the left? What kind of role can they play, between now and October 30th to get other people mobilized? And Lena, you were talking about voters who maybe will shift right to Lula. So is there a role that these leftist politicians can play in terms of convincing voters to then vote for Lula? It's just also something to think about.
So we do have a few questions from the audience as well, so I'd like to get to some of those. First question is from our very own graduate student in geography, Benjamin Kantner. Has the so-called Centrão, the coalition in Congress that supposedly holds negotiating strength with the Bolsonaro government, been strengthened or weakened by this election? And we might add to that too, what might their role be if Lula is elected in the second round? What might their role be in his next government?
Okay, maybe I can respond. Okay, the Centrão, I think, kept around 182 seats in Congress, which is huge. And also they expanded the number of senators they have now. So, because they aligned with Bolsonaro since the beginning. But of course, the Centrão, you see, we don't know how it will react. And so things can happen. As Gladys said, there are contradictory results. Maybe they have supported Bolsonaro now, and all the governors who have been elected from parties, with parties who participate, who are in the basis of the Central, maybe they will shift. It depends on who will win the elections. So if Lula win the election, things will radically change. This said, we have now an extreme right, the far right, institutionalized in Congress. So things will be much more difficult. But I think that the rule that the Central is always shifted from one side to the other, I think this still holds.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that if I may. I mean, I think the Central is a very kind of an interesting phenomenon. And part of that has been historically, in recent years, the MDB, the MDB, the Brazilian Democratic Movement, along with the PSD, the Social Democracy Party, and to a certain extent, the PDT, the Democratic Labor Party, because it split over the question of the endorsement of Dilma and voted very contradictorily in that regard. They now are all free to, these parties are free to endorse either candidate, and the majority are shifting towards supporting Lula. And in that regard, Lula will have to involve them in his cabinet if he's elected, and invite some of them into the cabinet. I think it's very clear for anyone who looked at the last debate that Simone Tebet was actually interviewing for her job in the Lula candidate during her debate skills to allow her to do that. So I think that Lula will be able to break off and bring into his realm sectors of the MDB, the BDT, and sectors of the PSD, who historically have shifted to which way the wind blows, depending on the favorable situation. But I think the other problem is there's a very hard right and a not a far right, but a right that's going to ally with Bolsonaro in the elections. And what's most interesting is the way in which the PSDB, this party of the Brazilian Social Democracy, which was the party that split from the MDB, and Cardoso was one of the founders. The historic founders of that are supporting Lula, including Cardoso was mentioned, which is very significant. José Serra, who was a former presidential candidate twice, and Ciro Gomes, although formally it's not a very strong endorsement. But the PSDB is really split, and part of it is gonna move to the right, and I think reorganize and split. And it's one of these parties that I think is not going to survive this polarization in a serious way. And finally, several other parties, like the New Party, have lost seats and now have lost the minimum number of candidates in Congress people and senators in order to get federal funding and logistical support for their party in Congress. And so it's going to weaken them more, and it's part of a trend and a pressure to eliminate or to kind of weed away some of the 32 political parties, of which 28 were in Congress, but now less of them are in Congress. So in the next elections, the barrier to be able to be legalized is going to be higher, and it'll be harder for people in smaller political parties to sustain themselves. So there's going to be, I think, a little bit of reorganizing as well as this polarization.
I think, if I may jump in, I think that it's very important to pay attention to what Jimmy said, because the number of parties in Congress now dropped from 16 in the last legislature, and now it's just, it's less than 10. It's around 9 point something, it's 10. So, and this shows that there is a reorganization of the political spectrum in Brazil, because as pointed out by Jimmy, we need a minimum number of votes for the parties they need to hold a minimum number of seats in Congress to continue to be represented. Otherwise, they will have to disappear and they will have to merge with other parties. And so I think this is also contributing to reorganize the far right, the right, which I call the right, because for me, you see, Jimmy, the Central is not the center right, PSDB, PDT, it's more center. I would put PDT in the left, But anyway, I think that I was talking about Central, it's the PP, PDS, all those old parties that came from Arena under the dictatorship, and that are really very conservative parties, and who have been supporting Bolsonaro since his first election in 2018. So I think that in any case, there is a big shift in Brazil, as you pointed out, which means that we'll have less parties running, and of course, they will get more electoral funding. So it's going to be very interesting to see the directions they will take in the future. Less fragmentation.
Wow.
Going to another of the audience questions. So we have a question from S. Dutra Silva, asking specifically about how the PT and the left should behave in the face of the very rapid growth in recent years of the far right in Brazil. Is the left prepared to communicate with this growing group? And what strategies would be important for this ideological struggle that at least the Brazilian right is framing as sort of like a struggle of good against evil? So how do you communicate with people who think that you are evil?
I can jump in. Do you want to say something, Gladys?
No, the thing that I was
Gladys, I think you have to take off your picture because your sound is really bad. Gladys, your sound is really bad. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Much better.
Yeah, much better.
Okay, great. One of the things that I was thinking about is when I just think about Lula's campaign, right? So he has mainly been seen as the candidate who, you know, he's kind of proven himself, but also he's the candidate to kind of continue democracy and save democracy. But I can't give a recommendation for a strategy, but I do think there has to be a strategy that includes like, okay, beyond saving democracy, which obviously is very important, for his voters, what is he going to do for his voters? Like, is there a platform that we can say, okay, Lula has said he's going to do X, Y, Z. We know that in the past, he built universities. We know that in the past, he supported affirmative action. He supported Bolsa Familia. We can go through all of these things, but I think that it needs to be very clear what his platform is, because as someone mentioned earlier, for Bolsonaro, his voters, they look at him as being the person who, you know, who's tough on crime, who is, you know, conservative, and but they're able to kind of point to things, even though there may be things that we disagree with. Just being the candidate who is going to preserve democracy, I'm not sure. I mean, so Lula got 48% of the vote, but in order to assure that he's, or ensure that he's going to win, they may have to go, you know, a little deeper or explain to voters more like what his platform is. So that's all I was going to say.
So I think in a way I could criticize the Workers' Party campaign a lot, but I think they have in the election material that's on TV and radio, I think talked about a lot of things that they want to do. I think Lula was cautious not to make too many promises that he didn't feel like could fulfill, given the complex economic situation that the country is facing. I think he's ducking certain problems that he doesn't want to have to deal with, such as abortion. And he just actually did a video saying he's not in the favor of abortion, which is unfortunate. But he also has done videos supporting LGBTQ rights, which is a hot button issue. I think the bigger problem that was asked by the questioner is the ability of the left to really engage in a conversation with the people. And the Workers' Party historically was able to do that in its founding, but moved away from that for many reasons and lost the kind of organic structural interaction with ordinary people throughout the country on a day-to-day basis, as they were more successful in winning office, and many of their leadership and capable activists moved into government positions supporting politicians or being a part of the government administrations. And I think that's one of the things that they need to do. To respond to Gladys, all of the elected Congress people I know are going to be extremely involved in this next 3.5, 4 weeks in the election campaign, supporting the Lula candidacy, and also certain governors who are in runoffs. And I think, unfortunately, the PT tried, and to a certain extent was much more successful in creating a mass-based campaign this time around, trying to organize it more effectively. They've really lost that commitment to grassroots organizing throughout the year. And the only way to defeat the far right is going to be to provide better governance and resolve more of the problems of ordinary people so they can see Lula as a person who gets things done, and organizing grassroots and communities in a much more broad-based way in order to have an ongoing dialogue with people who might disagree around religious issues, but might support the general perspective of the Workers' Party.
Okay, let me just add something, please. I think that it's going to be extremely difficult to put aside this ideological issue, which is family. Family, and you see the way people look at Bolsonaro as the one who is really protecting the Christian family in Brazil. And so it's very difficult because these guys are working in the social networks. Today, a young evangelical who is an influencer, he is followed by 33 million people. 33 million people. He has just expressed his support to Bolsonaro. So it's going to be extremely difficult in 2-3 weeks. Just do what Jimmy said. Commit to grassroots movements, exactly, because people are not taking to the streets. I participate in campaign trails here in Rio. I went to the beach. I was distributing flyers and things that nobody was interested. Nobody wanted to talk because it's not on the streets anymore. Of course, we have these big rallies that take place with Lula in Northeast Brazil, everywhere. But I think that Chomsky was right when he said, this is not what will bring more votes to Lula. So the big problem now is that we are in a much more difficult position because we don't use their techniques. Their techniques, you see, their lies, the way they use threats and fear to mobilize people, etc. We don't work like them. So I think that the only thing I see that could really help us break through this wall of lies and ideological issues is to have very good TV programs explaining how they, you see all the allies surrounding Lula saying, we're going to do this in the 3 first months, we're going to do that, because we know that there is also this spending cap. So it's going to be very difficult. So even this new coalition has to agree that they will help Lula to eradicate the spending cap and replace it by something else that would allow increase spending in Brazil, which is absolutely necessary. So I think it's necessary now. What is fundamental is to agree on some fundamental points in a program and come to the public and present them and explain how they will do it. And this has to be, you see, the 3 first months of Lula's election have to prove that they will behave accordingly.
If I may just respond to a little bit, when I was referring to grassroots work, I wasn't talking about the next 3.5 weeks. I was talking about strategically, to defeat the right strategically, and that requires tremendous patience. But in terms of the election campaign, to be very honest, if there are 1 million active militant supporters of the PT, all they need to do, every single one of them needs to get 5 people in their family and their social networks to agree to.
Very difficult, I can tell you.
It's I know it is, but it's possible. We live in bubbles, and the leftist lives in a bubble with everyone we know already is supporting Lula, and we have to convince people either not to vote for Bolsonaro and stay home, or people have to convince people supported Simone Tebet to vote for Lula as opposed to abstaining. Same for Ciro. And make sure that everyone who voted last time voted again. If everyone who voted last time votes again, there will be a likely tendency for Lula to win the elections regardless. And in fact, in one election, Alckmin actually got less votes in the second round, which could theoretically happen for Bolsonaro. I don't think that will happen though. But I think that's what is at the end of the day going to be necessary, is that individual one-on-one conversations, convincing people, one way or the other to vote. I mean, we don't have the PT, the left does not have the kind of capillarity, structured ability to talk to people who are not a part of their social networks in a serious way, because they've lost that. I mean, some sectors who do social movement organizing, etc. But in terms of really having a national influence, they don't have it.
But Jimmy, 21% of the electorate didn't go to the polls. They didn't vote.
Yeah.
Okay, so 21%, it's huge. It's around more than 25 million people. It's huge. So we need these people to get to the vote and to go to the polls. And I think that the only way to do it is to go to TV and show them what they're going to do, and put all the guys, Fernando Henrique, you see, by Lula's side, and all the others have this really coalition very clearly presented and saying, this is what we're going to do. We all agree on this. This is a minimum program that will be implemented as soon as we win the elections, and we're going to change things, etc. Because it's true that Bolsonaro, now he's kind of benefiting from, you see, a reduction in inflation rates, a slight economic recovery. It's not going to last, of course, but the big problem, as you pointed out, with regard to the budget for universities, they have cut off all public spending, all social spending. That's the big issue. And this is why people are looking more and more to individual alternatives, individual solutions. And this is the strength of Bolsonaro. See, not collective practices, not getting together in order to reinvent and to rebuild the country, but each of us looking for its own solution. And so I think that we need a very strong collective movement now for the next 2-3 weeks, putting everyone together and explaining to people what are the main topics of this transition program in order to elect Lula. Otherwise, these 21% of the electorate won't go to the polls.
I just wanted to add to that. So I agree with both Jim and Lena. And I think if you add to that, right, if people really kind of dig into their networks, along with social media, that has really been, impactful for Bolsonaro's campaign. And I think if Lula's campaign is able to do that as well, that it will also be effective. And we're just talking about until October 30th, right? In terms of the turnout that you just mentioned, Lena, with all of those people staying at home. If people can use individual social networks, that it could be huge. So I'm just also thinking about like beyond, television ads, because there are so many people plugged into all types of social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. So it could actually be very effective for the amount of votes that he needs between, now and October 30th.
So it's also important to understand that less people voted in 18 in the second round than the first round. I think that the 20%, no, 22% or 21% the population could have voted, didn't vote. So I think it's a question of guaranteeing that people who voted in the first round vote again, and that the Tebet and Ciristas move to the left. And if that happens, Lula wins. And I agree, Lena, you're absolutely right. The PT needs to be clear about its program. It needs to make that clear in the campaign. I'm assuming it's going to do that. If they're not, we have no influence over that. But yeah.
I'd like to jump in here to highlight a couple of questions from the Q&A. And this is Iris Bastos, who makes an important point that what you see going on in Brazil right now is kind of the inverse of what you see in the United States, which is that the more developed parts of Brazil went for Bolsonaro. And the other thing is the question about evangelicals as a serious and sort of implacable voting bloc. I think she raises very important points because these are somewhat different from what has traditionally been the case, where we always expected sort of a more revanchist North versus the more radical South, not radical, but progressive South. And now you see the inverse. So I'm curious about what your comments are to Iris.
I don't think that's a very good reading of what's going on in Brazil. I mean, with all love and respect. I mean, it's true. The Workers' Party in Lula has the largest base of support is under people who earn 1 or 2 minimum wages, $500 a month. And the higher your socioeconomic level, the more likely you are to support the Bolsonaro. That's true. And in the United States, depending on which demographic you're looking at, you know, African Americans are 80 to 90% Democrats, support Democrats loyally, those who vote. Other socioeconomic elections. The difference in the United States is that Trump managed to mobilize a sector of the white working class and white middle class and evangelical Christians to his coalition, and Bolsonaro's done the same in terms of evangelical Christians, and that means part of his base of support is working class, because many evangelical Christians are working class, and of all races, not just white middle class people. I saw that when I went to the rally on the 7th of September in Rio to see the socioeconomic composition of the people who were supporting Bolsonaro. I think, you know, in every country has a different history and story, and it's always impossible to do serious comparative studies between different countries. But I think that the similarities between Trumpism and Bolsonarismo and the way it is attracting large sectors of the population are significant.
I would just add to that what I found in my 2018 research. So I think when we make generalizations about evangelicals, yes, Bolsonaro received a lot of support from evangelicals, but we deny the fact that Lula also has some support from evangelicals, right? Not a large proportion of evangelicals, but he does actually have some support. And I interviewed those people in 2018 in Salvador, San Luis, and Sao Paulo. Again, Afro-Brazilian women, social welfare beneficiaries. So I know I'm talking about just a small segment of the Brazilian population, but most of the people, and we interviewed 120, these were in-depth interviews, and most of those women were evangelicals. That was the most popular religion. Second to that was Catholics. And then third, I believe, were Baptist, right? And they overwhelmingly supported leftist candidates, right? So it's difficult for me to say that Lula received no support from evangelicals, because of course he did, right?
No, he got at least 33% at least. Haddad got 33%. The polling indicates that for this time around. A little changes. I think it's shifting, but there's a third of the population of evangelical or Protestants support him, and Lula has support around 50 to 60% of Catholics. Based on polls. So
yeah, but I think, so that's also something that we can talk about, is that so Lula is resonating with some evangelicals, right?
Absolutely.
And yeah, so that is also a population that we, can't generalize. It can, we can say that he does have some evangelical support.
Yes, but let's not forget that in this election, so 3 days ago, the evangelical caucus remained the same as in the previous legislature. So it's important to understand that there is an extreme right, there is a strong far right that is moving around, that is increasing, and not only within the evangelicals, because the Catholics are also supporting Bolsonaro with his discourse on, protecting family, Christian values and things like this. So we have to understand that the issue is not only focusing or concentrated on the evangelicals. I think it's much more complicated.
I mean, I think comparing to the United States, what's interesting to me in the United States, there's certain blocks that are consistently Democrat, and African Americans is one block. Jews are 80% vote for Democrats, even though socioeconomically they're very well off in the United States as a whole. So there are certain blocks, and in Brazil there are blocks also. You know, people who wanted to minimum wages generally support Lula more than others, but a third of evangelical Christians supported Lula, and or at least Haddad, and I'm assuming a similar amount will support Lula at the end of the day, because they understand class issues as trumping, to a certain extent, some of their social religious ideas about, you know, issues, kind of the cultural war issues. Brazil is very complex, as they all say. Everyone says, you know.
Well, listen, we're getting up to the half hour here. Why don't we have like a 2 or 3 minute summation by our panelists, and let them go after this extremely stimulating and lots of food for thought kind of discussion. Lena, do you want to start, since I see you in front of me right now?
So thank you for having me in this panel, very exciting. And I really think that the most important thing now is to publicize this large coalition that the left is able to create. This is very important because you see, under the Workers' Party rule, it was very difficult to integrate or incorporate even criticism from the left. So it was difficult to really have a more critical approach about what was being implemented. We know that we are now moving again to the center right. So ideas that it would be under Lula that we would be trying to overcome neoliberalism. You know that everywhere in the world, people are thinking about reinventing capitalism. What is the new step? How can we reimagine capitalism and overcome neoliberalism? So we have to really guarantee democracy, and under neoliberalism, it would be extremely difficult. But in Brazil, we won't be discussing this. So the most important issue now is to guarantee that Brazil remains a radical democratic country. And then we'll see the rest later. And so we need those who were not voting to come to the polls and vote in 3 weeks' time. Thank you.
Lena, thank you, and what an inspiring comment. James, you want to go next, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one thing I didn't.
Go ahead.
There's one thing I didn't mention in my presentation, which I think is really important. We just kind of didn't talk about it. There's a large number of the population who believe that Lula was involved in corruption and will not vote for him for that reason. And there are many reasons why they believe that. A lot of the media for many years insisted on that fact, and so there's another element in there of kind of a feeling that they can't draw themselves to vote for Lula because they see him as being corrupt. And this is not just people who are pro-Bolsonaro, but they're kind of caught in the middle. I just couldn't agree more with Lena. I think the issue here is not just the next 3.5 weeks, but it's the next 4 years, regardless of who is elected president of Brazil, and the threats to democracy and the need to strengthen democratic rule in Brazil and support the progressive movements in Brazil. And that's one of the reasons why when we founded the Washington Brazil office, we invited social movements and human rights organizations to affiliate with our office. So far we have 45 social movements and human rights organizations who are affiliate members of the office. And our goal is to help them articulate internationally the concerns in the United States, in the Congress and beyond, because the need to have an international dialogue between what's going on in Brazil and what's going on in the rest of the world is really crucial. And so regardless of the outcome of the elections, the Washington Brazil office is here to stay. We're going to continue our work. And if you're interested in joining the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, you can send me or Gladys an email. I can be reached at Brown on the History Department website to get my email, and we'll invite you to our meetings. We're going to have a national meeting on December 3rd at Columbia Law School to evaluate what we've done for the last 4 years and what is our future tasks ahead.
So I'm just going to second everything that Lena and Jim said. And also, the first round of elections felt very much like the nightmare that we had here in the US, when many people thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and then we were shocked when she didn't. So I do not want to feel that or experience that on October 30th. So I just think it's important that people continue to mobilize, exactly what Lena and Jim just said. So people will have to do that in a number of ways. That's really my closing remark, is to say that the Lula voters who voted in the first round, they need to vote. And then, like Jim said, bring 5 friends, or, encourage people who voted not for Bolsonaro. They're not going to be convinced, but if they voted for, another candidate, convince them to go ahead and vote for Lula. And do that through either word of mouth or, like I said, social media. So the main point is to mobilize.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a very rich discussion. We had many, many participants, so you've got an audience, and this is important. People are very interested in the Brazilian election, and there's good reason to be so. Bryan, you want to, as they say, democracy depends on it in many ways, because the Brazilian outcome has a lot of international reverberations, and so we'll see what happens. And it's for this reason that there's so much attention on it. Bryan, you want to add something?
I don't have anything to say about the election that everybody else didn't say already. I just wanted to thank our panelists for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure. The next event for the Center for Brazilian Studies is going to be on Monday, October 24th. It's going to be a hybrid event, 2 p.m. here on campus, but also transmitted via Zoom. Historian Travis Null is going to be with us, and he's going to share his documentary film on organization among social movements in Rio de Janeiro in the 1980s to the present, that led to mobilization around issues of racial inequality, that led to progress in areas like affirmative action and university admissions. It's called The Book Revolution is the name of the film. So keep an eye out on the Latin American Institute's website for that. Unless anyone else has anything to say, I think we can go ahead.
Well, we also will have a review and an analysis of Brazil's position in the COP27 meeting. So Brazil has been a very important actor in the climate talks and climate politics. So, as they say, the hits just keep on coming. So again, thank you again to our panelists. And as they say more generally, stay tuned. There's much more. Brazil is, as we all know, the center of the world.